show that's 3 dimensions away from Nosferatu being called Count Orlok. I'm your host, 3D Jake, and today we're looking at Nosferatu, released in 2024. Nosferatu is written and directed by Robert Egger. The movie stars Bill Skarsgård, Lily Rose Depp, Nicholas Hoult, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Emma Corrin, and Willem Dafoe. The movie is essentially a remake of the 1920s film, silent film, that was essentially, this is the based off of the story of Dracula, which was basically a ripoff of the story of Dracula. And so that movie, of course, was made in the 1920s as a silent film. Then they remade it in the 70s with Klaus Kinski. And then this one, of course, is a remake of those two movies. Only this one, I would say, is more closer to the Klaus Kinski one. You know, the Werner Herzog one. That is the one it's more closer to than the 1920s film, because I will say, the movie almost feels like a beat for beat story beat of that movie. If you've seen the 1920s film, or not the 1920s, but the 1970s film, I would say that is a much closer adaptation of this movie. Although I will say this movie feels so beautifully well made. I mean, it is such a good film. Like, I was sitting there watching this going, I was not expecting this movie to be that great. Like, I was expecting it to be just like, oh, it's going to be a good film. Like, it was a really well made film. I mean, the movie itself does feel like, had a different director made this, I feel like it would be more of a love story. Although this is more of a story of a woman who wants love, and then she basically almost conjure up the devil, and which is Nosferatu, who is basically, she calls out for love, and then this evil presence answers her prayers, essentially, and it's Nosferatu, who is essentially Dracula, answers her prayers, and he's like, I'm going to love you. And so eventually he goes on this, like, he basically hires Nicholas Hoult to come. He gets like this minion who's basically Renfield, who, Knox, who is essentially hypnotized into doing his evil bidding. And he gets Nicholas Hoult, Hutton, who is essentially this character who basically goes up there. He was the Jonathan Harker of the story. He goes up to Count Orlok's castle, and Count Orlok basically locks him there because it's his wife he wants, and he's like, I'm going to kill you. Essentially every night he drains his blood, makes him weaker and weaker, so eventually he could just kill him, but he escapes. And so he's like, well, you know what, screw it. I'm still going to London, and I'm going to get his wife. But I will say, so it's really more of a story beat for beat of the Dracula story. But this one, I will say, I like about it is he brings a plague with him of rats. Like, it's a rat plague that's basically creates the Black Plague, and it wipes out London. He kills a lot of people because he's like, you know what? I'm going to destroy London from within. I'm going to bring a plague to London and wipe it out, but I will have the love of my life. I will have, this like woman who I call to. And I thought that was a really unique story aspect of the movie. I will say that one thing I did not like about this movie is, besides, it feels story for beat of the 70s movie, and on top of that, it feels much like there are certain characters in the movie, which I understand this is a remake of Nosferatu, not of Dracula, even though it's really a ripoff of Dracula. I understand that, but I was expecting it to be like, oh, wouldn't it be much cooler instead of they do like the Nosferatu ending? If they like, oh, they're going to destroy his coffin, and then they end up having to kill him, and he goes back to Transylvania to his castle, and they're going to, like in Bram Stoker's Dracula. I was expecting it to be more like that, but I understand Robert Egger does not really do that big of a scale of action. He's more of a smaller scale guy, so of course, it's not going to be this big impactful story. It's going to be a more condensed story. So it was my fault for expecting. That's what some of my friends were telling me. Do not watch this and expect it to be a big scale action movie. Like Bram Stoker's Dracula is more of an action love story than it is more of a horror love story, which is this. This is more of a condensed horror love story. And I will say, if you walk into this movie expecting it to be this grand scale story or an adaptation of Dracula but with the name change, I think you'll be more disappointed by that, because it does do a lot of changes. For instance, Lucy's death in the movie, which is, Aaron Taylor Johnson. Emma Corrin is basically Lucy in this movie. The Lucy, I believe, the character, Lily Rose Depp is essentially the love interest, like Mina of the story, where she falls in love with Orlok, and she's basically hypnotized and possessed by, Nosferatu, Count Orlok, and she basically is like calling for him, and she's horny for him the whole entire film. Like, literally, the whole movie, she's basically like, I want him so bad. Oh, I can feel him inside me, like that's how much she's saying in this movie. Like at one point in the movie, she is literally possessed, like, just like starts her eyes roll in the back of her head. She's like, and I know a lot of people, I read online, people were laughing at this performance because whenever she's possessed, like they're laughing because they think it's like the way she's acting is kind of funny, even though some people were upset that people were laughing about that, saying, "Oh, this is a woman that's being taken advantage of in the movie, and she's really like being overpowered, and you're laughing at her misery." I'm like, first off, it's a movie, okay? It's not real. Like, there's no vampires that can do that, and and first off, I understand, but I'm like, at the same time, I mean, if somebody was there are scenes in like the Batman where the Riddler is having issues, and I'm just sitting there laughing because it's like, well, Paul Dano, the way he sells it, he's like, no, ah! I'm just like, okay, that's funny, okay. I mean, there were scenes even in Prisoners when he did, in this movie, I did see start laughing whenever she did. She's like, ah, I was like, it was kind of funny. I'm sorry, but it made me laugh too. I was like, this is kind of funny, It's like but it's unintentionally funny, But I thought it was funny. There are times where people laugh at things that are not meant to be funny, but it's just it's everybody has a different coping mechanism for their sense of taste, And I thought this was, though she did do a great job in the movie, because you do feel like she is a victim in this movie, and you feel like Dracula is getting his claws deeper and deeper into her, and eventually to where eventually, like, which I will say, whenever the whole movie before her, it's like they see it like she's lovesick for her husband, but then when he comes back, she's kind of normal, back to normal. I'm like, I didn't understand that. So then like, he's sick, and then she's taking care of him. I'm like, okay, I didn't like that aspect. I'm like, wouldn't it make more sense if he comes back? Yeah, he's sick, but yet he's trying to care for his wife, and they're both sick. And then Van Helsing comes in and tries to help them both. That would have made more sense to me. But instead, you have, and Willem Dafoe, by the way, is great as the Van Helsing character. He is so good in this movie that, he's like this crazy guy who is an outcast, but he believes in this whole the supernatural and the occult and all that stuff. And he's just like, oh, I like how he plots against. He's like, we have to kill the vampire. So essentially, we're gonna go, and we know that we're gonna kill. We're gonna go to his house and burn his house down. But you don't worry, your wife. Me and her made a plan where she's gonna, like, basically the only way to kill Nosferatu is sunlight. So we're basically gonna, like, let him feed on her and she'll die, but we'll defeat the vampire. I thought that was interesting, and like he was like, look, sometimes you have to do a lesser of two evils, and I thought that was a really great, because it really is a story of like how far will you want to go to achieve your goal, And I think that is really something, like, because I mean, Nicholas Hoult just wants to basically better his life. And Aaron Taylor Johnson's rich, and he just wants to see his kids grow up and wants to be happy with his family, and have his best friend. And then of course Van Helsing, essentially his character is, he wants to basically prove him right that he is like the occultist realm. He wants to basically, this basically is the thing he's been waiting for his whole life. And then Nosferatu basically wants, he's lonely, and he basically sees this, this character, she calls to him, and so when he goes to her, he basically gets to feed off her. He gets what he wants, and then of course he dies because she lets him feed on him until sunlight, and sunrise kills him. I thought that was a well done story, and I thought also Nicholas Hoult, and I thought like the plague spreading through. I thought it was better than the Werner Herzog version of the movie, but I thought it was great seeing these rats and seeing dead people. There's one scene that gets me. Is whenever Aaron Taylor Johnson's sleeping in bed and his wife is sleeping next to him. She wakes up and sees that Dracula is, Count Orlok is feeding on her kids, and then he feeds on her, and then all three of them are dead, and he's just like broken as a broken man. And then he goes back, and then he dies from the plague. And I thought that was like, just the most messed up thing was the plague kills him, not Dracula. I thought that was just so messed up that he dies from the plague. I was like, oh man, that was so messed up. I was expecting Dracula or Nosferatu to kill him. I was like, oh man, he's gonna kill him. But instead, I mean, I thought it was great though. And then how, like, and of course how Knox, who is basically the Renfield character, how he kills the guards and escapes and everything. He's doing Nosferatu's bidding and everything. And then he ends up killing him. And I thought that was great. And I mean, the whole movie does feel like everything pays off that it's set up, and I thought it was really well done. It's really terrifying, Bill Skarsgård, especially. There's a scene where he's laying in the coffin, and when he figures out that Nosferatu, Count Warlock, is a vampire, he opens it up, and he's about to like impale his heart. He wakes up and grabs him, and the sun goes down. Like, oh shit! And he's after him, and then he sends those dogs. I'm like, oh man, it was such a cool scene. I really enjoyed this movie a lot. I'm definitely gonna buy it when it hits 4K. If I had to give this movie a grade, I would give it a solid A-. Thank you.
Nosferatu.